most fearless and effective advocates I have ever run into. And some of her recent work, her most recent work and her most recent successes could revolutionize the way we approach ending homelessness and approach social policy and advocacy in Canada. Leilani is the UN Special Rapporteur for the right to adequate housing and is also the Executive Director of Canada Without Poverty. In her role with the United Nations, she has been advocating for the right to housing and doing some amazing work around the world. And more importantly, right here at home, she's been a leading advocate for the right to housing. If you remember in my opening remarks yesterday, I mentioned that we're in a place now where the government is working on legislation to have a federally legislated right to housing in Canada. Yes, that's right. That is something I certainly wouldn't have dreamed even possible a few years ago, and a lot of that's a result of Leilani's work. And the second big thing that she's done is a court challenge where, with Canada Without Poverty, they challenged charity law and restrictions on charities' abilities to lobby. As you know, homelessness was created by policy. And many of us working in charities need to be able to lobby to fix the thing that caused homelessness. And her court challenge frees charities up to do exactly that, which is a huge win for all of us. So I'm going to quickly introduce Leilani with a video of a documentary that she is featured in.
Y no ellos, como inmobiliaria no lo han pedido permiso. Y volaron todos los árboles, no hay nada. El parque Barón, la palabra parque es cero.
A new owner came and took possession of the building. They were breaking locks for the main entrance for the building. They were physically pushing their way into people's apartments upstairs.
I hear stories of nurses and doctors and police officers and firefighters who are unable to afford to live in the city where they're supposed to be guarding and helping. I'm giving you this notice because I want to end your tenancy.
They came after her with the hardest category they could.
The neighborhood's getting gentrified. It's moving. It's come right up to King and Dufferin, and it's only one direction into our neighbor, and we're in the way.
When I hear people today saying it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction, is, if only. It's much deeper than that.
Housing has become overly financialized, so it's like gold. But gold is not a human right. Housing is.
They want to raise each apartment, they'll rent up to like $900 each. If it goes to $3,400, I have to make at least $100,000 a year.
Schools are closing down in areas where there's a concentration of vacant housing. Shops are closing down, restaurants are closing down. You lose the diversity and the richness of a city.
These dark, empty buildings, and they are making money. So when people think, oh, poor investors, something went wrong, hell no.
One of the councillors said, if you can't live in Notting Hill, then you shouldn't be in Notting Hill. What's all that about? Who the fuck is he to say something like that?
Preparing for a meeting with the largest landlord in the US, what questions would you have the Special Rapporteur ask, depending on who I meet there?
You might want to go big picture, ask them what they think their obligation is as a corporate citizen.
If I can get them to talk about the human side of this, then we might get somewhere. They canceled the meeting.
Oh, shit.
Are you a legal scholar actually on human rights, or is you just
Yes,
okay?
yes,
So
that's right.
You have the instrumentality that is the law.
Exactly.
Because what I see is those with power, boy, can they deploy the law
In ways that work for them. Stuff is happening,
Ladies and gentlemen, everyone, Leilani Farha.
Stuff is happening, indeed. Many years ago, I met a woman in New Orleans named Naomi. This was in the aftermath of Katrina, the big hurricane that opened the levees and caused massive flooding. I met Naomi outside of her destroyed home. She was African American, in her 60s, physically disabled, using a wheelchair. Naomi wanted to show me her home. It was a small white bungalow structure with steps leading up to the front door. I offered to help her get up the stairs, but she refused, telling me she wanted me to see her daily reality. She hoisted herself out of the wheelchair and proceeded to drag herself up the stairs to the front porch and then into the front hallway. It was about 45 degrees in the house, and there were bugs swarming around us, so much so that I couldn't even take notes. Her floorboards were torn up, and I could see down to the foundation. There was no working toilet, in fact, no running water. She was using a dry toilet and then carting away the refuse when she could. It was, in my opinion, hell. After Naomi told me her story, I asked her how she felt living in the richest country in the world in these conditions. Naomi looked at me, and without skipping a beat, she said, "Abandoned." This sense of abandonment is something I hear repeatedly. The idea that if you're poor and homeless, you don't count, you're invisible. In some instances, not treated as human. I have heard it countless times everywhere I go. I have heard it here in Canada from my board of directors who live in poverty, from the many women with whom I've spoken living in shelters, and most recently by the residents in Herongate in Ottawa, a racialized community of 500 or so being displaced. The question is, how did we get here? Or, as I recently said unceremoniously in California after spending 10 days looking at homelessness there, how the fuck did we get here? A comment, I should say, that was picked up by the media. Don't tweet that. Naomi's words have long reverberated in my head. Abandoned. Abandoned by whom exactly? She had a community of support, family members, friends, community workers, helping her to get to doctor's appointments, to haul water into her house, and to help her find food. No, by abandoned, she meant her government had abandoned her. And she is right. Governments the world over have abandoned people. Let's remember, worldwide, 100 million people are living in the streets, facing daily threats to life and security, and this number is on the rise. 1.6 billion people lack access to an adequate home, living in informal settlements or encampments under the constant threat of being evicted, many lacking fundamentals of clean water and toilets. In Europe, homelessness is increasing in every country except Finland. In many countries, states respond to homelessness by criminalizing and stigmatizing people for sitting, for standing or lying in public places, or for carrying out activities necessary for human survival, like eating and sleeping. In many places, homelessness is directly related to the unaffordability of housing. In cities across the world, including here in Canada, housing costs are skyrocketing and not commensurate with incomes, making it impossible for moderate and low-income residents to manage. In the Greater Toronto Area, for example, in the last 30 years, housing prices have increased by 425%, whereas in a similar 30-year period, average family income has only grown by 133%. Hamilton has seen this all too clearly, with rents increasing at a higher rate than in equivalent places like Quebec City, and increasing, in fact, more than provincial averages. Hamilton has also seen a sharp rise in applications for evictions, an increase of 95% in a 6-year period. And it is always the most vulnerable that are the most affected. Indigenous peoples who have historically and continue to be forced off their lands and are subject to practices of colonialism. Persons with disabilities who are either institutionalized or deinstitutionalized without adequate supports. Migrants who are often considered less deserving of public supports. Women and youth leaving violent households with nowhere to go. LGBTQ and others facing some of the harshest forms of discrimination, and so on. People are being pushed out of their homes, neighborhoods, and communities. In my opinion, all of this is testament to Naomi's claim and the claim that so many others have said of governments, that claim of abandonment. In particular, government's abandonment of a commitment to human rights. So again, how did we get here? I think in Canada, the generally accepted narrative within the housing sector is that in the 1990s, the federal government walked away from housing in a meaningful way. They ceased funding any new social housing while dismantling other social protections and untying social transfers, resulting in a fairly rapid rise in homelessness and housing inadequacy and insecurity, all of which is ongoing today. But this doesn't exactly explain the why, the root causes of the here and now. The root causes lie in an ideology that was promulgated in the 1980s under Prime Minister Mulroney, and that really took hold by the end of the 1980s, and that became our dominant paradigm in the 1990s, and that continues well until today. And that dominant paradigm is neoliberalism. I admit that when I first started articulating the problem as rooted in neoliberalism, I felt slightly self-conscious. I worried that I would come off sounding like a predictable lefty. But as Special Rapporteur, I have had the unfortunate opportunity to get up close and personal with neoliberalism. I have seen it in action in Chile, where the housing sector itself is based on Milton Friedman's neoliberalism in its purest form. And I have seen it in agreements between the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and many countries like Egypt and Portugal, for example, that have had austerity measures imposed on them. As it happens, back in the 1990s, when Paul Martin was taking decisions to de-invest in social housing and slashing social programs, he was doing so on the advice of the very same IMF. Neoliberalism is an ideology that believes the unregulated market will take care of everything, and that governments should take a big step back from social protections and supports. In the housing sector, it means reducing protections for tenants and making sure housing is wide open to the unregulated market. Now, in the 1990s and early 2000s, that neoliberalism looked pretty bad. But when you add financialization of housing to the mix, it creates the impossible conditions we are seeing in cities around the world, including Vancouver, Toronto, and Hamilton. By financialization, I mean where housing is viewed as a commodity or a place to park excess capital, where housing is treated as a financial instrument rather than a home. Of course, housing has long been financialized. We have had a mortgage system in place in Canada for many years now. That's a financial product linked to housing. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is something new. There is unprecedented wealth in the world, and a lot of that wealth is being parked in housing. Housing is used as a mega profit generator. Sophisticated financial instruments turn housing into a lucrative stock, resulting in uber profits for some and driving up rents and reducing the availability of affordable units for many. Housing is now invaded by financial actors, banks, pension funds, private equity firms, REITs, real estate investment trusts, shareholders, and rich individuals, all of whom view housing predominantly as a place to park excess capital, of which there is an abundance, and to turn a profit. Few of whom view housing as home. And they are buying up properties, particularly in neighborhoods they call undervalued, where affordable units still exist. Properties where they can squeeze more profits. Ontario's market is dominated by a few large corporate actors in residential real estate, which creates monopolistic markets, almost like price fixing. Ottawa's Heron Gate is an example where a multi-billion-dollar asset management firm evicted an entire racialized community of renters, some of the lowest income people in the country, and they're going to demolish that housing and not replace it with anything that would be affordable to those residents. Hamilton's InterRent is another player. They are behind the renovictions in East Hamilton. But who is InterRent? InterRent is, in fact, a real estate investment trust, a REIT, not a landlord. A REIT, and follow me here, is an alternative corporate structure that groups properties together and then allows for everyday investment in holdings, often through the stock market. InterRent's website specifically says that they, quote, focus on medium-sized, multi-family residential properties in Ontario's mid-sized population markets, targeting working-class and middle-class long-term renters. So you might be living in an apartment in East Hamilton, and your landlord could be a shareholder in Vancouver, and the shareholder likely has no clue that they are your landlord. Let's be clear who these actors are working for. Who are their clients? Their clients are investors. They're working to ensure their investors get a good return on their investment. That means their clients are not tenants. This is the new housing landscape. There are unprecedented amounts of capital flow into residential real estate, and these actors often have more power and quick money at their disposal than do governments, which gives them a whole lot of political power and leverage. There are, of course, other manifestations of the financialization of housing, such as short-term rental platforms like Airbnb and HomeAway, which result in the increase in the development of luxury accommodations and the reduction of available housing stock that could be used for long-term affordable rentals. And then there is speculation on just a grand scale. Individuals of ultra high net worth, I'm talking about billionaires, who park their excess capital or hide their excess capital in real estate with no intention of living there, driving up local prices. The impact of this is that people are being pushed out of their homes, their neighborhoods, and their communities. Rents are rising, people are being evicted in greater numbers, and falling into homelessness. Existing housing stock is deteriorating. New stock is luxury or high-end for investors, not for tenants. So what happened to governments in all of this? All of this is happening quite legally through financial structures that governments have helped to create and that they have failed to regulate. While governments have abandoned tenants and low-income residents, they have not abandoned investors. And the importance of government's relationship with real estate cannot be underestimated. Look at who some of the big investors are in Canada. Pension funds, which play a very important role in the wealth and stability of our economy. So I think we all need to get our heads around the fact that housing or residential real estate is now big business. It is the biggest business in the world. It is now valued at $163 trillion US dollars. And if you can't get your head around that, it's not surprising. The GDP of the US is about $19 trillion. So $163 trillion is almost the world's GDP times 3. Massive. In Canada, real estate drove 1/5 of the Canadian economy in 2017. Housing as a commodity is integral to the Canadian economy, to business, and to financial worlds. So, now you know what we're up against when we say we want to end homelessness and ensure access to adequate, affordable, and safe housing. Clearly, we can't tinker with programs and policies. Clearly, we need more. I think it's important to note that the decision of governments to support housing as a commodity or an investment, and the complementary decision to withdraw conceptually and in practice from housing as a social good, cannot be regarded as just any old policy decision. As you heard me say in the film, housing is not gold. Gold is a commodity. Housing is not. It's a human right that governments around the world, including governments in Canada, have committed to. I want to remind you that though today's landscape is new, it hasn't always been this way, at least not in Canada. If you look to the 60s and 70s, you'll see that housing was viewed as providing personal security and not necessarily wealth. Governments played an active role through legislation and policy in ensuring that a variety of housing options were available for diverse household incomes. Home ownership, rental accommodation, and public or subsidized housing were all options. Homelessness and the unaffordability of housing as known now didn't really exist, at least not on today's scale. Without painting too rosy a picture, I think we can say that housing was generally understood as a social good, and it was aligned with the understanding that housing is a human right for all, a place to live in dignity. So how do we get back there? I think what's required is a seismic paradigmatic shift. This shift would affirm that deprivations of the right to adequate housing are not just program failures or policy challenges, but human rights violations of the highest order, depriving those affected of the most basic human rights to dignity, security, and life itself. It would recognize that housing can no longer be understood as a commodity or as an asset or a place to grow wealth, but must be embraced as a social good necessary for the well-being of individuals and society alike. But more than anything, if we're going to solve homelessness and grossly inadequate housing, we need governments to show up, all levels of government, and they need to show up in ways that they have long abandoned and to show up in new ways to counter the very sophisticated and deeply entrenched causes of homelessness and inadequate housing. I think governments, I think governments need to adopt comprehensive human rights-based housing strategies. Governments need a framework that will result in structural change, that will prevent homelessness, and that will address barriers to adequate housing. So I'm often asked, well, what's so essential about rights-based housing strategies? Think about homelessness, grossly inadequate housing, evictions, stereotypes and stigmatization of people based on their housing status. What are all of those things, ultimately, if we distill it? They are all assaults on dignity and life, and they challenge what it means to be human. These are human rights concerns, and these should trigger human rights responses. Human rights claims identify the structural and the systemic barriers to the realization of the right to housing, and they create change by ensuring effective remedies. Human rights also change the way governments interact with people who are homeless or inadequately housed, recognizing them not as beneficiaries of charity, but rather as rights holders, active subjects, empowered to engage and be involved in decisions affecting their own lives. Yeah. A rights-based approach clarifies who is accountable to whom. All levels of government are accountable to people, particularly marginalized and vulnerable groups. And lastly, human rights incorporate universal norms which bring coherence and coordination to multiple areas of law and policy through a common purpose and a shared set of values. Earlier this year, I presented a report to the UN outlining 10 principles that all rights-based strategies must have. I'm going to give you 3. 1, Housing strategies must be based in law and affirm the right to housing as a legal right. Strategies must ensure rights-based participation to ensure meaningful engagement with persons with lived experience of homelessness and inadequate housing. 3, strategies must ensure access to justice. This does not only mean access to courts. Strategies must include access to hearings and remedies that are accessible, and ensure a means for marginalized groups to identify the systemic barriers to housing that they experience and ensure effective responses. Independent tribunals, commissions, ombudspersons, or advocates can play an important role. So those are my demands to government. And yes, I think the government of Canada is inching toward this. But what role do charities and nonprofits and non-governmental organizations and individuals play? I want to speak directly to the housing and homelessness sector, those of you working in this sector. I want to say this. I think we need to start doing our work differently. I think we have to change what we think about. I think we need to recognize that this is a different fight than we have had before. And it's going to require different tools and different strategies. I have to say, I'm not sure the sector is there yet. We have to realize that it's not just about getting more money to flow to services and programs. It's not just about having social housing built. It's not even just about getting the right to housing in legislation, though that would help. It is much bigger than that. And that's why I agreed to be in that film, Push. I wanted to reach different audiences than us. I wanted to start new conversations. I want to provoke. So let me end with my to-do list for you. 1. So there's five things on my to-do list. My kids hate my to-do list, so here you go. You may hate it too. 1, download the Kickstarter app on your phone and find Push the film and provide a little support, because we need to show that the right to housing is an issue worth investing in ourselves. 2, think twice before you rent an Airbnb on your next vacation. Find out if Airbnb or whatever short-term rental platform you're using is regulated in the city you're visiting before you book it. 3, ask your pension fund if they invest in residential real estate, and if they do, ask them not to. It's now common for employees to demand of pension funds that they not contribute to climate change through their investments. We need to start asking our pension funds to stop making investments in residential housing. 4, when you see a homeless person, see that person as the result of the commodification of housing and the failure of governments to effectively implement the right to housing. And then go tell your kids, a friend, or a neighbor that that's how you see homelessness. 5, start asking public officials why the right to housing isn't included in any legislation in your province or any bylaw in your city. Or if you are a public official, become part of the solution. Regardless, go to legislate the right to housing. I think there's a slide that's going to come up. and read the letter about why the legislated right to housing is so important, and consider becoming a signatory. Already there are more than 800 signatories to that letter. Make your voice heard that way. I guess what I'm asking is for you to find your outrage. Don't accept the unacceptable. Push back. More than 235,000 homeless people in a country with the 10th largest GDP in the world and the fastest growing economy of the G7 is not acceptable. It's shameful. And it's not acceptable that Canada will only halve chronic homelessness in the next 9 years. Canada is a rich and sophisticated country, and it can do better. We have to stop government's abandonment of people and stop their abandonment of human rights. Thank you.